what I'm going to say is part of my current largish project, which is, to put it in the vaguest possible way, about wildness and domestication. So start in 1826, when in an article in the Literary Gazette about the London Zoo, newly founded, it was headlined, Zoological or Noah's Ark Society. And that's the plan of the zoo as it was to begin with. Now, at least in the early years of the zoo, the second element of that headline, Noah's Ark Society, turned out to have a double meaning. Its primary reference, and doubtless the only one that was intended, was to what has mostly remained the standard stamp collection principle for the selection and acquisition of zoo animals, that is, at least one of each, maybe better, two, so that they can make more. But as it turned out, the headline contained an allusion to Noah's mission as well as to his passenger list. And I probably don't have to remind you, but I will. As God says to Noah after the flood, he says, "Bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee of all flesh, both of fowl and of cattle, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth." Now, the collection of the zoo proper was assembled and maintained, of course, to serve the purposes of public edification and scientific research, rather than with any idea of species preservation or of large-scale propagation. The animals on display in the menagerie, however, were not the only chattels of the fledgling Zoological Society. So even before they possessed either any creatures or really even any place to put them, the Society's founders had outlined sweeping and ambitious goals, of which one was unconstrained by the limits of their prospective acreage. And this was the introduction of new and curious subjects of the animal kingdom to enhance and diversify existing British livestock. So when the Zoological Garden at Regent's Park opened its gates in 1828, a small area was reserved for what were termed breeding experiments. These quarters soon, which is to say immediately, proved to be inadequate and unsuitable, and so in 1829, the inhabitants were moved about 10 miles west to a farm in Kingston near Richmond Park, which offered more space and fewer distractions, although it was still easily accessible from the center of London. And you can see, compared to the previous plan, that this is a lot more like a farm and a lot less like a zoo display. Now, the animals that were there at Kingston were not different in kind or kinds from the animals in the menagerie, but the range of species was significantly smaller, and there was therefore room for more individuals of each particular kind. And they included various species of deer, sheep, goats, zebras, kangaroos, zebu cattle, rabbits, ostriches, emus, gallinaceous fowls, that is, wild relatives of chickens and turkeys, ducks and geese. And here is a zebu. So that is allowing for a few imaginative flights, or in the case of the ostriches, imaginative non-flights. They were close allies of the domesticated animals that occupied most British barns and fields. And they had also been selected to accommodate a narrower human constituency than the one that was drawn to the Regent's Park Zoo. That is, the fellows, the people who ran the Zoological Society. Of course, they were all interested in wild animals from the perspective of natural history, but many of them were also elite agriculturalists who shared more practical concerns with regard to animal breeding and animal husbandry. So in its 1829 annual report, the Council of the Zoological Society defined the objectives of the farm expansively. So these objectives were to include providing a retreat for animals who found the menagerie environment stressful, and also conducting experiments with about all matters of relating to breeding and points of animal physiology connected to breeding. But the core aim was much more focused. It was effecting improvements in the quality or properties of domesticated quadrupeds and birds that were used for the table, and likewise in domesticating subjects from our own or foreign countries which have not hitherto been inmates of our poultry or farmyards. So this was the reason why, for example, the zoo or the zoo farm circulated a questionnaire to poultry breeders asking them to rate various types of domesticated fowls and also wild game birds with regard to qualities such as beauty, productivity, and courage. It was why it mated zebras with donkeys to see the resulting if the resulting hybrids were better in some way. And as you can see, this is a current American Z-donk. It's not a hard thing to do. And why the zoo responded positively to requests like the following. The Duke of Bedford presents his compliments to the Secretary of the Zoological Society, and he begs to know whether he can spare him a Cereopsis male goose, which he could. As it turned out, the farm's first years were its only years. Maintaining live animals was and is expensive, and the young society's finances, like those of most zoos then and afterwards, were fragile. So it turned out not to be feasible to sink scarce funds into an enterprise that engaged only the wealthier fellows of the Zoological Society, and really not all of them, and certainly none, or almost none, of the ordinary visitors who came in at the gate. So by 1832, that is after only about 4 or 5 years, the Society had begun to auction off the farm animals, that is the wild animals who lived at the so-called farm, and they had all been sold by 1834. They didn't fetch impressive prices, especially in comparison with the stud fees that the farm had been charging. For example, a pair of Chinese geese sold for 10 shillings, and a doe of the North American elk sold for only 4 guineas. In comparison, the stud fees had ranged from 5 shillings for the services, as it's called, of a zebu to £2 for those of a zebra. And even those were trifling in comparison with the stud fees that were fetched by elite bulls, rams, and stallions of ordinary domesticated breeds. Now, although this failure or set of failures seemed definitive, it wasn't catastrophic. That is, mostly what it showed was that the Zoological Society wasn't the appropriate home for such endeavors, and that the market for exotic domesticates or potential domesticates was very limited. But differently situated and institutionalized, both interest in the farm's agenda and attempts to realize it persisted through the 19th century, and as I'll come to in the end, actually far beyond. But before I talk about some of those attempts, I want to emphasize a few intrinsic oddities about this agenda. So from the middle of the 18th century, give or take, elite agricultural improvers had been obsessed with breeding, that is to say, with the development of superior breeds of domesticated livestock. I mean, they had been obsessed with other things too, like soil chemistry and farm machinery, but I'm not going to talk about that. Anyway, this was the period in which the apparatus that continues to certify excellence in domesticated animals, that is things like pedigrees, shows, breed societies, etc., all this apparatus emerged. Overwhelmingly, this obsession led breeders and fanciers increasingly to restrict the range of genetic contributions to prized livestock strains, often choosing even to pair very close relative siblings or parent and child. But the farm of the Zoological Society offered a diametrically opposed mode of enhancement. So it's worth thinking about why, at a period when purity was highly prized as both a means and an end in breeding, human as well as otherwise, and when civilization, which we could understand as the human version of domestication, was widely esteemed as an index of national and racial superiority, the possessors of valuable strains of domesticated animals should have desired to mix their rarefied blood with that of wild animals of different species or foreign animals of different breeds. And why should they have attempted to supplement the indigenous fauna of Britain and ultimately of British settler colonies with alien species? Why, that is, should this kind of mixture and admixture have been regarded, at least in some circumstances, as embellishment rather than contamination? So, as I said, there were many indications of continuing interest, at least among some people, in this kind of genetic infusions. So although the London Zoo farm existed only briefly, it wouldn't have existed at all if some of its influential patrons hadn't desired to avail themselves of the stud services and surplus animals that it was established to offer. And after the institutionalized support of the Zoological Society was withdrawn, as before, these people continued to pursue their interest in domestication and hybridization on the more restricted canvas offered by their own estates. Although, actually, not all these estates could be characterized as restricted, or even actually as more restricted. And indeed, the strength of this impulse to supplement and enhance was most visible in the largest collections. So the 13th Earl of Derby, who served as the president of the Zoological Society from 1831 until his death 20 years later, owned an assemblage of living animals that rivaled that of Regent's Park. But the selection and distribution of species at his estate at Knowsley Park near Liverpool was very different, bearing a greater resemblance to the zoo farm, the defunct zoo farm, than to that of the still existing menagerie. And in fact, his massive collection of exotics represented a hypertrophy of his early interest in game birds and dog breeding. So it was intended to serve utilitarian purposes as well as scientific ones. So he produced hybrids between several Asian pheasant species and the local pheasant population, which of course was also derived from Asia, but in the past. And among all 4 species of South American camelids, he also commissioned elite artists to record his animals. So these are his alpacas. He maintained a breeding herd of elands, which is the largest and meatiest of the antelopes, and therefore a persistent object of gustatory desire. There are a few of his elands. And it's clear from the coverage of the auction of his collection after his death that he was mostly interested in creatures that people, or at least some people, would like to eat. And this is the coverage from the coverage of the auction in the Illustrated London News. His son, who was soon to become prime minister, couldn't get rid of the animals fast enough. So at the end of the 19th century, another aristocratic president of the Zoological Society, the 11th Duke of Bedford, made this inclination towards the table more explicit. He also accumulated an impressive collection of exotic wild animals at his estate at Woburn Abbey, but it contained only ungulates and a few other grazers like kangaroos and wallabies, so deer, goats, cattle, gazelles, antelopes, tapirs, giraffes, sheep, zebras, llamas, and asses. And this is the most famous of his animals. He rescued, or he acquired, some Père David deer already extinct in the wild in China, just before the political upheavals of the early 20th century made them extinct. So all the ones that you see in zoos are descended from his. Anyway, in 1905, he printed a summary census of his collection, and which made it clear that he collected with a view to what was called acclimatization. So he explained that of the animals that he had, if they appeared temperamentally unsuitable for domestication, that is, if they were too mean, they were summarily dispatched. And if they were unsuited to spend the winter outside in the English climate, nature was allowed to take its course. Now, as was the case in many spheres of endeavor, in the course of the 19th century, this kind of heroic individual effort was increasingly subordinated to public or institutional efforts. So impressive as his menagerie was, for example, the Duke of Bedford didn't deal with the Zoological Society as an equal partner, as his predecessor, the Earl of Derby, had done 6 decades earlier. The institutions that emerged in response to this persistent desire to integrate attractive, exotic attributes into domestic barns and domestic bloodlines were not zoos per se. That is, they labeled themselves as acclimatization societies, not as zoological gardens, although, like many distinctions, this one becomes fuzzier the harder you look at it. But in their heyday, which was the last half of the 19th century, there were a lot of them, scattered across Europe as far to the east as Russia, across North America, and throughout the colonized world. The British version, which was the Society for the Acclimatization of Animals, Birds, Fishes, Insects, and Vegetables within the United Kingdom, was established in 1860. It had a tenuous connection to the Earl of Derby, since it was inspired by a zoological dinner at a London tavern in 1859, at which the gathered naturalist and menagerists enjoyed the haunch of an eland that was descended from the Knowsley herd. The declared objects of the society were grandiose and diffuse: to introduce, acclimatize, and domesticate all innocuous animals, birds, fishes, insects, and vegetables, whether useful or ornamental, to perfect, propagate, and hybridize these introductions, to spread indigenous animals, etc., within the United Kingdom, to procure animals, etc., from British colonies and foreign countries, and to transmit animals, etc., from England to her colonies and foreign parts. And it's worth saying that that very similar language had been included in the prospectus for the Zoological Society, so another indication of the very permeable boundaries between these kinds of institutions. Now, unsurprisingly, the Acclimatization Society made very little progress towards achieving these grand goals. In the event, its members mostly confined their attention to a scattering of birds and sheep to very little effect. The society itself survived only through 1866, that is 6 or 7 years, when it was absorbed by the Ornithological Society of London and vanished without a trace. But not all such societies were similarly evanescent. Those that turned out to be more robust relied on more than the interest of their members, which was relatively insubstantial, even if it was intense. That is, they also controlled both animals and real estate. So the French Société d'Acclimatation possessed both of these advantages, and it also enjoyed government support and more mainstream scientific sponsorship. The most prominent scientist associated with the British Society was actually a bit of a nut. Anyway, the French Society, founded in 1854, immediately began holding monthly meetings, publishing proceedings, and expressing its extreme interest in hybridization, especially of exotic long-haired sheep. And before it was a decade old, its Jardin Zoologique d'Acclimatation opened its gates in the Bois de Boulogne, and as its name suggests, it too was conceived as a hybrid institution. It included the kind of attractions that by then had become standard for a zoological garden and that were consequently required by the zoo-going public: That is, it had big cats, it had elephants, and other kind of iconic animals, but those only constituted a part of its collection, and not the most important part, at least in theory or in principle. Its core mission was much more pragmatic, distilled in the term applied zoology. So it was intended as a laboratory for the study of acclimatization, and its priorities were distinctively pragmatic. And this emphasis helped to determine both its acquisition policy and its exhibition policy. Its initial displays emphasized the economic potential of animals from French colonies, especially for some reason from Algeria, and it housed the largest collection of exotic agricultural animals in Europe. So this is its zebu, or its zebus, which, yeah, were attractive to everybody, I guess. But although its animals and its data were available to French agriculturalists, even it didn't affect any noticeable transformation or enhancement in either the wild or the domesticated fauna of France. In fact, the most effective acclimatization societies were established on the other side of the world, that is here, in the British colonies that became Australia and New Zealand. There wasn't any discernible time lag in the transplantation of these metropolitan institutions to the Antipodes, nor was there much modification of the acclimatization agenda in acknowledgement, for example, of environmental differences. So in 1861, the Acclimatization Society of Victoria described its objects in much the same language that had been used repeatedly in Britain. The introduction, acclimatization, and domestication of all innoxious animals, spelled a bit differently, whether useful or ornamental, the perfection, propagation, and hybridization of races newly introduced or already domesticated, et cetera, et cetera. And this language was subsequently borrowed by similar societies elsewhere in Australia and in New Zealand. These colonial acclimatizers were strongly aware of their predecessors, and they were determined not to be impeded by the obstacles that had felled earlier attempts. So a hortatory lecture that was delivered in Sydney regretted that the farm of the Zoological Society of London was either from the expense or some mismanagement given up after introducing only 3 species of geese and a few other minor birds. And it also warned that the dispersal of the Earl of Derby's stock, said, must be a sufficient lesson of the uncertainty of private collections and the necessity of founding societies based on a general and public interest. Now, the range of mooted targets of the society was as ambitious and fanciful as it had been in Britain, including babirusa, which is kind of wild pig, and giraffes, as well as the somewhat more plausible antelope, deer, sheep, and goats. As in France, at least some of these societies had their own premises, so within a few years of its foundation, the Acclimatization Society of Victoria owned camels, llamas, alpacas, several species of goats, sheep and deer, hares, and various kinds of birds and fish. The focus on consumption, that is to say ingestion, was equally strong as it had been in Britain, so it was similarly hoped that antelopes would offer a change from the monotony of beef and mutton, and that the appealingly large South American curassow could supplement more pedestrian fowl. Even the Australian fauna, which were routinely derogated by acclimatizers on both utilitarian and aesthetic grounds, could be drafted to serve in this campaign. So adventurous eaters claimed, I know this is inappropriate for you guys, that the flesh of the wombat is always a great treat. The opossum is good, especially when curried or stewed. And the monitor lizard, if one could overcome the repugnance of its appearance, is a delicate and excellent food. At a celebratory dinner held in Melbourne Hotel in 1864, this was described as a fitting tribute to the cause of acclimatization and also a complete triumph of gastronomy. Among the entrees were curries, pâté, and salmi, in which wombat, bandicoot, and parakeet figured conspicuously. So the desiderata repeatedly promulgated by acclimatizers were notably miscellaneous. That is to say, it would be difficult to derive a coherent sense of the faunal assemblage that was their ultimate goal from analyzing the species that they wanted to acclimatize. Or maybe another way to say the same thing is that there's often a radical disjunction between the pragmatic goals espoused by the acclimatizers and the species that they suggest as the means of realizing them. So to give an example, another Australian society suggested the following targets for acclimatization and domestication: kangaroos, kangaroo rats, the bandicoot, the echidna, emu, the bustard, hares of several species, the chinchilla, antelopes of several species, wild sheep, hedgehogs, the robin, and the hyrax, which is a diminutive relative of the elephant. And this actually is a list that shows a certain amount of restraints. There are some acclimatization advocates who wanted to enhance their homelands with, for example, large exotic carnivores. But despite the eccentric tone of a lot of acclimatization-related discourse, and also of behavior for that matter, in both Australia and New Zealand, acclimatization societies received some public respect and support, inspired, I would say, by varying degrees of official enthusiasm and inspiring varying degrees of taxpayer outrage. But at least in some places, they were endorsed by God as well as by Caesar. So parish clergymen in Victoria were encouraged to persuade their flocks that a society that multiplies the gifts of an all-bountiful creator is worthy of the support not only of the philosopher, but also of the Christian. In both places, the acclimatizers also had to deal with mounting suspicion that some of their introductions were doing more harm than good, so that, for example, the Australian societies repeatedly swore that they were not to blame for what had quickly become a plague of rabbits. And even the journal Nature chimed in from half a world away, stating that the English Acclimatization Society fortunately came to an end before it could do any harm here, but its example has been mischievous in our dependencies, which of course is putting it mildly. Anyway, so the exploration of 19th century attempts to revivify extant faunas, either by introducing new species or by livening up existing ones with exotic blood, reveals a lot of inconsistency and confusion. But it does highlight the persistent appeal of the alien and the wild, even when the dominant consensus suggests otherwise, and even when it's hard to tell what is wild and what is not. And this kind of confusion or ambiguities also characterized other animal-related activities, of which I now will talk a little. So, to return to Britain, as I said before, one of the indices of 19th century Britain's self-assigned position at the top of the civilization league tables, as they might call them now, especially ahead of its continental European competitors, was the subdued placidity of its countryside. And this was understood as the consequence of heroic labors at an earlier period. There had been a time when solitary laborers and travelers had been as vulnerable in Britain as they continued to be in the wilds of Asia or Africa or North America. So this is a 19th century imagination of British wolf hunters in the Middle Ages. And a different 19th century zoologist surveying the mammals of Britain reported that during the Anglo-Saxon period, wolves were so numerous and so terrible were their devastations during the winter that January was designated the wolf month. So the Norman defeat of the English humans in 1066 had been the prelude to their ultimate triumph in a long war of attrition against non-human predators who finally disappeared in England during the early Tudor period. So as the naturalist James Edmund Harding reflected more generally in a book that was entitled The Extinct Animals of Britain, published in 1880, he said, the moors and woods and glens which we now traverse so securely were infested with ferocious animals, not just wolves, but also bears and wild boars. They're back. But Harding was of at least two minds about these developments. That is, he had chosen his topic with nostalgia as well as with relief. Although English life was surely easier and more efficient without these creatures, it also could seem somewhat diminished. And so, to quote him again, he says, the interest which attaches to the history of extinct British animals can only be equaled by the regret which must be felt by all true naturalists at their disappearance beyond recall from our fauna. Now, Harding obviously wasn't expressing the views of a majority of his compatriots, but neither was he completely idiosyncratic. After all, since early in the previous century, the 18th century, even the word savage had collocated with noble as well as with more negative terms. And during that same period, there were other more concrete indications of the rising stock of wildness. So while many rural magnates were devoting themselves to agricultural improvement, which intensified human control of the landscape and its animal inhabitants, a few paradoxically prided themselves on the herds of wild cattle, so-called wild cattle, that roamed on their estate. And this is the most famous image of such cattle by Edwin Landseer, the wild cattle of Chillingham, in an improbably nuclear family configuration. Anyway, these animals allegedly descended directly from the Aboriginal aurochs without having endured a humiliating interlude of domestication. The most celebrated herd, this one, lived at Chillingham Castle in Northumberland, where they served as, in effect, totems for the Earls of Tankerville. And so that meant that they were never shot, although they did serve as a kind of symbolic or sacrificial meat on special occasions, like the coming of age of an heir, but they weren't butchered. Someone could go out and shoot them. This is the future King Edward VII, having shot a ferocious bull. Their descendants actually still roam the park at Chillingham, although the Earls of Tankerville have departed for North America. And if you go there, you can be led to view them being wild, and they will tell you a lot of stories about them. Now, the qualities that the wild cattle embodied, strength, aggression, and independence, resonated with those embodied with some other elite mascots, most notably the lion that represented both the monarch and the nation as a whole. But a sneaking fondness for wildness, and even the possibility of connecting with it, gradually trickled down the social ladder. So lesser folk could thrill to such discoveries as the Kirkdale Cave that was discovered in Yorkshire in the 1820s by miners. And it made clear that there had been an extinct and much more exciting fauna in Britain in the Pleistocene. It was a cave that had been the habitation of hyenas, and so it had their bones and the bones of the things that they ate. This is a satirical cartoon. That man is supposed to be the naturalist William Buckland. Still further back, so the hyenas more exciting than mere wolves and bears, and still further back, there was even better stuff. An England that had been populated by giant reptiles belonging to an order that was christened Dinosauria in 1842 by Richard Owen. They rapidly became, as they've remained, popular favorites, and large models of dinosaurs adorned the grounds of the Crystal Palace after it was moved across the Thames to Sydenham. This is an image of a celebratory dinner held inside the Iguanodon by naturalists before the models were unveiled for the public, and there they still are. And Britons were not the only people for whom wild cattle seemed like accessible representatives of their connection to a more heroic national or ethnic past. As I said, among the many distinctions claimed for the Chillingham cattle was relatively direct descent in comparison with other cattle from the aurochs, which is the ancestor of all current cattle, including the zebus. And this is a skeleton of an aurochs in the National Museum in Copenhagen. So no aurochses are now living, except in a strictly cladistic sense, but they haven't been extinct for very long. The last one, a female, was killed in what's now Poland in 1627. And in addition to skeletal remains like this, there's plenty of human testimony about them, beginning with the cave paintings, for example, like this one is from the caves in Lascaux in southern France. They were hunted by the Romans, who made hunting horns to blow on out of their horns. And this is a horn not made by Romans, but apparently or allegedly made from the last male aurochs who died not too long before the last female one. And they figured in the bestiaries compiled by naturalists who might actually have seen them. So this is from a 1556 bestiary. And despite this long coexistence and this plethora of evidence, they seem to have slipped quickly out of mind as well as out of sight. So by the time, just a few centuries later, that wildness was beginning to exert its distinctively modern appeal, the confusion that's noted in the caption of this image, which basically means ignorant people call me a bison, had become pervasive. And just to make things a little clearer, the European bison, or Wiesent, doesn't look much like an aurochs or like a Holstein or a Jersey, for that matter. What it does look like is an American bison or buffalo, which is the only other extant member of the genus bison. So here is a European bison. Here is an American bison. There's the European one. Again. But as I say, people were confused. So in 1847, a popular sporting periodical excitedly announced that the London Zoo, again, had received the most important addition that has ever been made to it, which was the aurochs, or European bison, part of the last remnant of this noble race, the sight of which will carry back the classical reader to the German wars of Rome, and the paleontologist to the days of the mammoth and the mastodon. One thing that is interesting, although not for me to develop right now, is that this confusion was equally distributed among specialists and non-specialists. You find the most elite scientists mixing these animals up, and you find writers for ladies' magazines getting everything sorted out in the way that scientists understand it now. But anyway, the connotation of the label, aurochs, was always the same, even though its denotation might vary. The animal in question was always noble and rare, imposing and threatened. And the fact that the significance of the aurochs remained constant, whether it was an extinct cow or a living bison, strongly suggests the large symbolic or metaphoric component of its appeal. It was a representative, whether already extinct or on the verge of disappearing, of a wilder, stronger, nobler, and purer Europe. And the importance of this set of associations is also suggested by the aurochs' more recent fans. By the end of the 19th century, most people were clear that the wild aurochs was extinct, and that however engaging the bison or Wiesent might be, there was something different. But that didn't mean that everyone was happy about this situation. So somewhat paradoxically, or maybe very paradoxically, the refinements in the theory and practice of domestic animal breeding that have been developed in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries have inspired a series of attempts to resurrect the aurochs, and thus, indirectly, many more recent rewilding endeavors. So in the 1920s and 30s, two German brothers, both zoo directors, Heinz and Lutz Heck, attempted to recreate the aurochs by breeding back from various European cattle breeds that they identified as having retained characteristics that they considered primitive. They proceeded separately. One was in Munich, the other was in Berlin, and they began with somewhat different images of what the original aurochs had looked like. They also chose different breeds as the basis of their reconstructions, and they nurtured them in somewhat different settings, one more in pasture or field, the other in the more confined setting of a zoo. But nevertheless, they both produced what they characterized as an aurochs, and each of them was appreciative of the other one's accomplishments. Now, people who observed from a greater distance have been more critical. Some of this criticism was practical, since both brothers concentrated on superficial characteristics such as color and horn shape, and neither kept careful records of either his original stock or the pedigrees of the animals from which he produced his aurochs. And this is a comparison of, on the top, what the aurochs would have been like in terms of configuration and size, and on the bottom, what are now called Heck cattles. So those are practical criticisms. But there was also political criticism, since both brothers were ultimately associated with the National Socialist regime, and the symbolism surrounding this allegedly primordial European animal was readily incorporated into Nazi ideology. So the reputation of the Heck brothers, as you can imagine, was greatly diminished after the Second World War, but their cattle have continued to enjoy a kind of niche esteem. There are a few herds of them scattered across Europe, mostly because people like them. There are some that live in Germany. But also, they are in a few places like Oostvaardersplassen, which is an area in the Netherlands where there's an attempt to recreate a pre-agricultural European landscape. Now, there's only one herd of them, as far as I know, in Britain, and they arrived in 2009 when their announcement inspired a certain amount, their advent inspired a certain amount of media attention. So an article published in the Times, which is a fairly respectable, sober publication, combined both sets of associations, both political and prehistoric. So it said, a shaggy cow story, how a Nazi experiment brought extinct aurochs to Devon. But this was actually mild in comparison with some of the other headlines. And at least some of these cows have recently come to a bad end. They've been executed, and the headline for this picture was Devon farmer forced to offload aggressive Nazi-bred super cows. And this is from The Guardian, also a reasonably sober publication. But this discrediting of the Heck brothers' efforts actually hasn't meant the end of efforts to bring back the aurochs, inspired by very similar understandings and very similar values. According to an organization called the Taurus Foundation, which is based in the Netherlands, the aurochs has always been at the very root of the whole idea of a continent called Europe. It is, in fact, our continent's defining animal. And using recent, although not the most recent, technologies, they've developed a breed called the Taurus, which is spelled a little oddly. But anyway, here is a Taurus bull. And it's currently being introduced in 7 or 8 rewilding locations all across Europe, even as it also is continued to be refined and improved by breeding. The claim is that it replicates all the benefits of the aurochs, with regard to landscape and ecological maintenance while eliminating some of its drawbacks, such as extreme ferocity, although actually some of the people who are fans of the aurochs sometimes suggest that it wasn't really as ferocious as people like Julius Caesar made it out to be. But all of this makes the Tauros breeders sound a lot like the 18th and 19th century English magnates who like to think that their unruly cattle were actually wild beasts. But at least so far, there's one big difference, which is that none of these aurochs replicas have been promoted as potential objects for hunters or butchers, even on special occasions, or at least not yet. But if they propagate enthusiastically, this happy situation, happy at least from the perspective of the aurochs, yes, may not last. When a species loses the cachet of rarity, even iconicity may not be enough to spare it. So nothing could be more iconic than the American buffalo, but too bad. Thank you.